final thought on modern theologies dealing with Trinitarianism. And this is kind of the bottom up or from below approach to Trinitarian theology, where we've kind of wanted to say, hey, if we see something in Jesus' life and ministry, we want to know if that's somehow reflected in God's eternal triune being. So, for example, the obvious example is, so if Jesus is crucified, can we say that God was crucified? Can we say that God suffered, right? Well, there's a question, and it's basically this. Okay, well, Jesus probably did a lot of things, right? Jesus probably put on sandals, okay? Jesus probably combed his hair. Jesus probably trimmed his beard. And there's probably things in the gospel, the narration of the gospel that Jesus does, that are kind of, I don't know if you want to say superfluous, but just not the kind of things we want to build our notion of the Trinity out of, right? So, for example, Jesus takes a nap in the boat while the disciples are stressed that the storm's coming. We probably don't want to say, oh, well, Jesus took a nap in the boat. Let's see what that means for Trinitarian theology. It seems like that's kind of a superfluous detail, something that's not of theological merit. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But you can see that would be a good example. And the issue is this: how do we know how do we know we're not just speculating wildly? What do we have some kind of indicator that what we're doing with the life of Jesus is theologically sound? And I think the answer to this question is we're not just looking for what's going on in the life of Jesus. We're looking for something that's been true of God's nature and character from creation to Revelation, and you could say eschaton. What I mean is, one of the reasons I'm not worried about ascribing suffering to God is that it's not Jesus who is this novel example of suffering, divine suffering. Yahweh God suffers in the Old Testament. Yahweh God is brokenhearted when people sin. Yahweh God is immeasurably hurt by Israel's rebellion, and moreover, God continually takes those hits, takes the pain that human beings inflict on God, and uses that as a catalyst for redemption. And so what I'm saying is the cross unique? Yeah, it's unique, but it's not exactly unexpected. Okay, if you're following the Old Testament narrative, you shouldn't be surprised that God's ultimate manifestation, God's ultimate act of redemption is to divinely suffer and die. God's been suffering at the hands of humanity since the very beginning, and it's never changed. So my point is that this thing about Jesus, the crucifixion is not a one-off. It's not as though this is just brand new. And it was unexpected because and you can fight about why that was unexpected to the Jewish people in the first century. But looking back, once we know that Jesus is the manifestation, the true manifestation of God in the world, and that true manifestation ends in death and resurrection, you can go back and you can see the pattern of death and resurrection in God's life and Israel's life all throughout the Scripture, all throughout the Old Testament, all throughout the Torah. The wisdom literature is surprisingly rife with this. It's so interesting that the caricature of wisdom literature is like, oh, this is how you live a good life, do X and get Y, is vastly complicated by the experience of Job, for example, and Ecclesiastes. The prophets are the same way. The prophets are constantly explaining that God's hurt, God's in pain, and God's putting up with that pain for the ultimate redemption of the people. And so I think that if we're going to do something, if we're going to take, and again, Jesus' liminality is another example. When we say Jesus is liminal, well, isn't it odd or isn't it interesting that God's people have always been a liminal people? And then God, in God's self, when God gives the law to the people, think about this. The Torah, the most important, the way of life. When is it given? It's given to the people in between Egypt and the Promised Land, right? Like, liminality appears to be something that Yahweh endorses in the Old Testament. So I do think there's danger in just like picking willy-nilly and being like, oh, well, Jesus took a nap, so God likes to sleep. I will say, though, that there is the theme of rest and Sabbath all throughout Scripture. And so I don't want to say that, rest isn't something that we should think about triunely. I think there's plenty to be said there. But we should recognize that the canon itself, and this is the key part, the canon is what authorizes us to make theological speculation. If what we're doing theologically with, say, the life of Jesus or some random story in the Old Testament, Jephthah's daughter or whatever, if we're trying to come up with Trinitarian thought, we'd better be able to see that same pattern, that same capacity, that same nature and character of God and God's people throughout. If it's just a one-off, then I think we're on dangerous ground. If, however, the full counsel of Scripture and the overall push of the trajectory, the narrative trajectory of God's redemption of the world, if it seems to exhibit certain characteristics, liminality, suffering, whatever, then I think we've got a good reason to say this must be accounted for. However Trinitarian we're going to be, this has to be accounted for. And if you want to be a classical theist, great, but you have to be able to account for this. Why is it that this is the way things are, and what relation does this fact about God's story with humanity, what relation does that have to God and God's self?